Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Share the adventures of our early pioneers as we explore the development of the Pacific Northwest and beyond. With your host, Mike Roberts, and historian Bill Barlee.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts with Bill Barlee, our storyteller about things in British Columbia, the Pacific Northwest. We've even ventured occasionally into Alberta and northwest of Washington State and up in the Yukon. But today, right sort of into the center of British Columbia. And you know, this place never really held anything for me, sort of a romance. But hearing you talk about it, this is a neat spot.
Sure, I view it entirely differently.
Where are we going?
Quesnel, not to be confused with Quesnel Forks. Now, there are two Quesnels.
Yep.
The first Quesnel really was Quesnel Forks. And then there was another Quesnel, which was called Mouth of Quesnel or Quesnel Mouth. Later became known as Quesnel. Both of them on the Quesnel River. Both established actually in 1859. Now, Quesnel, the town we're talking about, I think has a very interesting and fascinating varied history. Came into being really in 1859. Mind you, the Indians had camped there, and it's on the junction of two rivers, Mike. It's on the junction of the Quesnel River where it drives into the Fraser River. So it's a natural place. The Indians camped there for generations, probably thousands of years. But when the Fraser River rush came up in 1859, a lot of the miners went straight on, right up the Fraser. They weren't good prospectors.
They were more eager. They were too crazed to find the gold.
They were going headlong after the gold. But some of these miners were experienced. And one of these was a guy called Black McDonald, or Ben McDonald. Ben McDonald came up here. He stopped, panned the area, panned the junction where the Quesnel came in, which they called the canal.
They didn't pronounce things too clearly.
That's right.
Okay.
And so he went east on the Quesnel. And he went up to Quesnel Forks, and then they eventually branched out into the Caribou. But behind these individuals came the Chinese in the wake of the white miners. And there were some very wise Chinese came into this area. And they looked at this flat, and they looked at it with a different eye. They knew it wasn't in the center of the gold fields, even in 1859 and 1860. The gold fields were to the east. The major gold fields in the Caribou were to the east and far distant. But they looked at this and thought, this may become a distribution point. So right then, as early as 1859, some of those Chinese established their headquarters right on that particular junction. And it was very interesting, Mike, because they were basically right. Now, what was happening in the interior is they were establishing towns like Quesnel Forks, and then Keithley, and then Antler, and as the rush went on, they went into Van Winkle, and they went into Stanley, and Barkerville, and Richfield, and all those towns, which were only temporary towns with one or two exceptions.
Yeah. Where did the Chinese get this acumen? Now, this is a tremendous piece of wisdom. Build a distribution point and feed all of these things.
Sure.
Where did the acumen for this kind of thing come from?
I don't know whether, I think it's probably one of two sources. First of all, many of them are Cantonese. Some are Hong Kong Chinese, but most were Cantonese. Cantonese have a history of being very shrewd businessmen. Now, whether it came from Quang Li, or whether it came from Wali or Yanwar, I don't know. But one of those probably came to that conclusion, and the other said, we agree. They probably got together on it, so they established this, and they began feeding the immediate Chinese miners right around. And these miners were on places like Rich Bar and Ferguson Bar and 9 Mile Bar and Cornish Bar, north and south and east and so on in various directions. But the center of that little tiny spider's web was the place they called Quesnel Mouth.
All right. Take a break. You'll be back in a second and show how this place developed over a remarkable stretch of history right after these words. Don't go away. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. We're talking about Quesnel today. Around about 1860, 1862, it becomes obvious that it's not going to be Barkerville. It's not going to be. It's going to be Quesnel. That's going to be the hub.
No, it doesn't become obvious, Mike.
Doesn't it?
The government was backing its bet. They thought first Barkerville would be the main town. It would last forever. And then Van Winkle. They centered on Van Winkle. They built government buildings there, and Van Winkle didn't last at all. So now they were caught. They were in a bit of a bind. They had to fall back in another town. And they saw that the Chinese were staying with Quesnel. So they said, maybe we better back our bet. We better start plotting the towns. They laid out a town site in Quesnel in 1862, which hundreds and hundreds of acres, and they laid that town site out, and then by 1863, they held the first public auction of lots, and they sold for up to $400 a lot, which in that day was a lot of money.
It was indeed.
And by 1864, their view was, I think, generally considered accurate, because they had now about just over 100 Chinese settled permanently in Quesnel and just under 100 whites. And that's very interesting, Mike, because it's one of the few towns in British Columbia of any significance that had a 50-50 population. 50% whites and Indians, and 50% Chinese.
Now, what fascinates me is the way, how do we know anything about the Chinese? Because, of course, to read the European history would be to say that the Europeans did it all. Where is the record of the Chinese contribution?
Well, you have to go to a number of different records, Mike. First of all, there are some diaries extant from the day, and some letters, so you use those. You also use the newspapers of the day, which are sometimes quite accurate, sometimes not so accurate, and any other source that you can get hold of. But those are probably the two most commonly used sources, and generally they're fairly accurate. If you're extremely careful in your research, they're fairly accurate. And I found by studying the area of Quesnel itself, the Chinese were so right, because they assumed that there were going to be gold rushes not just confined to the Caribou district. So they knew there was gold to the east. They assumed there'd be gold to the north as well. And they were right. And what happened really in the 1860s is rather interesting, because by the mid-1860s, 1866, 67, the bulk of the Caribou gold rush towns were on the wane. And the gold, the easy gold, the shallow gold, that placer gold, you know, the shallow gold is got by these miners. Some of these miners were taking 100, 200 ounces a day each, which is really staggering, Mike, really quite staggering. But the shallow ground was gone in a few years. It doesn't take them long to clean it out. And so they were in a bit of a bind. But what happened? Again, this is a town that had 9 lives. It really did. Because then there was a discovery to the north, and this was the Amanika district, when a guy called Vital LaForce and a guy called Michael Burns drifted up north and discovered creeks like Vital Creek and Silver Creek and Manson Creek and Germanson River. Magnificent.
Yeah, Omanika's a long way away from Quesnel.
Only one funnel they could go through.
They had to go, and this had to be the supply route, even though Omanika was so far away.
Sure it did, because most people traveled by water. The Fraser was still the great highway.
Yeah.
Who was situated on the Fraser?
Quesnel.
There you are.
Perfect.
And not only that, they were lucky again, because when the Amanika began to decline, they then found new ground in the Cassiar district. So you had Thibert Creek and Dees Creek and McDame Creek and Defoe and all the rest. That was in the early 1870s. Again, a lot of the miners came through Quesnel. Now Quesnel starts to get a name for itself. Now they start coming up the river with sternwheelers. The Enterprise under the infamous or famous Captain Doan, who liked his liquor. And you can see that in all the old records.
What's the consequence of being a liquor-loving captain of a sternwheeler on the Fraser? Was it fraught with peril?
Well, sure it was, because the sternwheelers were a very delicate craft. You had to know every sandbar on the Fraser and where to be extremely careful and where not to be careful. Actually, Captain Doan was pretty lucky, but there were captains who weren't lucky. And of course, you had to watch your steam pressure as well, because sometimes it would blow the sternwheeler to blazes into the next century. And that did happen on the lower Fraser especially, and in other places in British Columbia. So the sternwheelers came in, and then the Caribou Road in the mid-1860s came into being, and we had the famous BX, the British Columbia Express. Sure, Bernard's famous express. One of the famous express lines in the West. Wells Fargo is the most well-known. I think the second most well-known is the BX, the British Columbia Express.
It was actually bigger than Wells Fargo, wasn't it?
Well, at one time it was. That was when Wells Fargo had declined because the Union Pacific Railroad had come in, Mike. So you must assume that the Wells Fargo days of stagecoaching really lasted from about 1852 to about 1863, just over a decade. So really the British Columbia Express became the classic stagecoach line of Western North America.
And it freighted everything in there.
Sure it did.
And the banks moved in. Of course, once you see sternwheelers making regular stops, you've got to have your...
And there were lots of banks. You had McDonald's Bank, which a lot of people didn't trust, and some did, some didn't. And of course, the Bank of British Columbia, the first Bank of British Columbia. And here we see a shot of the first Bank of British Columbia, and it's a log building. And they treated the customers pretty well. Everybody who came in, all the men who came in, got a free plug tobacco, and the guys used the side of the building actually to put furs on to dry them out, And the bank didn't like it, so that's why they piled up cordwood on this side. You see.
Just to keep it from happening.
That's right, keep it from happening.
Today they give toasters, then they gave plugs of tobacco.
Sure.
And that's where the prospectors had to learn to trust, and so the Bank of BC was a place they could trust, and they brought their poke in. And
oh, sure. They dealt in, and they even trusted the bills from the Bank of British Columbia. You know.
Even the bills.
Yeah, which is really unusual for the prospector because they generally trusted, Mike, they trusted gold and silver. And but there were other businesses in there. There were white merchants came in, Reed came in, and of course 3 very famous Chinese merchants. And first was the great Quan Li, which we've discussed in Yale. He had an empire all through the interior. He was there. And then Yan War, who was a significant merchant. And then Wali. Now, Wali was a very, very fascinating individual. And the Wali family is continuing. It still has a store in Quesnel, but it's under the name of Keene. And these are the grandsons of Wali and the great-grandsons of Wali. And Wali established such an enviable reputation, it is almost unmatched in the annals of history of British Columbia. Because there were people who had heard of Wali and his honesty. They would come in with pokes full of gold. They wouldn't even weigh it. And they'd give it to Wali and say, look, I'm going out on a trip for 2.5 months. I want you to take this and keep it for me in safekeeping. Thousands and thousands of miners evidently did that to Wali. There was never one complaint about the honesty of Wali.
And you know, there could have been shysters who would have said that, but not even a shyster tried to bilk this guy.
Nobody dared.
Nobody dared?
No,
what
because
kind
his reputation was so well established in Quesnel and all through the goldfields, nobody would question Wali. They would question the individual who questioned Wali.
Look, we've got right here a gold scale. Now, this is a recent acquisition of yours. It's such a beauty, and it is a Chinese gold scale from that era?
Yeah, it's really quite marvelous. This came from the Hong family, and the Hong family is still in Quesnel and Barkerville. Old Bill Hong, I knew him well, and I'm very pleased to have his gold scales because this was owned by his father before him. This undoubtedly came into the Caribou in the 1860s, Mike. You see this has a hallmark.
There's a
the
stamp.
Hallmark is,
yes. The Queen's stamp is here.
And it has the maker's hallmark just on the other side of that.
Yeah.
And the Queen's stamp indicate that the scales indeed are accurate. Now you're picking up a Chinese weight that weighs several pounds, and they would be weighing gold that weighed 4 and 5 pounds at a time, Mike.
And they just put a little gold in here.
And the pouring tray is marvelous.
Look
the Chinese had such an eye for beauty. I mean, they make a copper tray, so it kind of offsets too much brass. They wanted a copper tray. And this was used right from the 1860s, right into the 1940s, because there's a stamp down there, Mike, just ahead of you, a paper stamp that this has been checked by the Weights and Measurements Department of Ottawa, 1941 or 42.
Right on
so it was in business for 1940s, and of course, Bill Hong, who just passed away some years ago, wrote So That's the Way It Was, a book, very, very fascinating book. He weighed literally hundreds and hundreds of pounds of his own gold on this scales.
That is a wonderful treasure to find, and not only that, but to find the story behind this one. How many gold scales like this would there be poking around? This looks like a precision instrument, so there couldn't be that many.
One in Vancouver. I have this one, plus I have the gold scales from Quesnel Forks, another smaller one, and a number of other very much smaller ones. There's one in San Francisco. I believe there's 1 or 2 in the Wells Fargo Museum. Probably 7 or 8 in all of North America, that's all.
You got 3 of them.
Yeah.
Nice work. Now,
well, it's very important historically.
On the top here, this is is this mahjong? What kind of gambling game is this?
This is mahjong, and this is the excuse me,
Fan
mahjong. No, this is mahjong. You're right. This is mahjong, and these are the various sticks. And mahjong and this is the original mahjong. People have sets like this, but they have the Occidental or our numbering. The original Chinese sets do not have our numbering. So you'll see that this is an original set done in brass and rosewood. This is, I believe, rosewood. So, and the gamblers were in their off hours. They would gather in the Chinese stores, and it was partly social and partly that they'd gamble with some of their earnings from the gold fields, and they did extremely well.
Now you were mentioning Wali. Wali was sort of his own minter too, wasn't he? Because this is a token, and it actually has Wali's. It's been severely bent somewhere, but it's got Wali's name right on it, and it was worth $10 in trade.
Wali believed in advertising.
Yeah.
There's another one of his advertising methods. He actually had That's 1890s, I think, Mike, yeah.
Yeah.
And so he took time out to advertise. And, of course, he did extremely well. And Wally really didn't have to advertise.
Now, not all of the coinage that was used in British Columbia was minted by the British or minted by Canada.
No.
This is all Chinese silver.
Yes, it is, but that comes from some of the port towns. But the Chinese felt that there were two good metals, silver and gold.
Yeah.
And silver, they usually went by weight. So this says 20 cents, so that would be worth about 20 cents. It's probably 80 or 90%. I don't know, and I should know, but I don't offhand.
So this would be even given in trade to a European miner, and he would then be able to use this, or was this pretty well confined to the Chinese?
This would be exchanged between the Chinese. This would be accepted by the Chinese. Probably not by the European miner unless it was a Hong Kong coin.
Yeah?
Okay, because that was a British protectorate after.
This is, you called it counterfeit, but it actually is a trade coin too.
It's also counterfeit. Now, the original trade coins that were traded into China were silver, and the Chinese trusted them.
This looks like American.
And this is a trade dollar. I don't know what the date on that is, Mike. It's probably 1870s or 80s.
This is 1876.
Okay, 1876. And a lot of those went into China to help the white miners in places like Wallace, Idaho, and the Coeur d'Alenes because they wanted to keep silver circulating. And they made a lot of these and shipped them into China. This was one that has a copper base, so it's a counterfeit. And the Chinese would have picked up on that right away. They would have caught that.
Even though it says on the front of it 120 grains, 900 fine, it wasn't. It was. It was a bit. Now some of the
absolute nonsense.
Now, what do you find treasures? Some treasures are as simple as a little, what seems to be tin box, but
that's right.
This is what a wonderful. What would it be used for? Do you know?
Mike, I don't know, but obviously a medicine of some type because of the construction of the box. It's almost a pewter, and this Chinese lettering on the front would tell you exactly what was in the box. And probably made in Canton, or the environs of Canton. And, but I don't know what was in the box.
My apologies if I'm holding it upside down. I don't read Chinese. I think this might be right side up. And we should get somebody to translate this for us.
Actually, I've had a lot of my work translated by Winnie Louie at the UBC, so I do have Chinese translators that are available to me.
Finding these things tells us that there was an established culture here too.
Culture.
I mean, that Chinese brought that with them.
Yeah. Well, not only that, Mike. Here's some. Here's some. These are equivalent to sterling silver. They're probably 80 to 90% silver.
Who would have worn these? Would these have been worn by men or women?
Well, actually, men also wore jewelry of this type. In fact, I found a bracelet along with Doug Dodd, an old friend of mine, on a Chinese camp way up the, well, some miles north of Quesnel. And we found some silver jewelry and some gold jewelry, which I showed in a program some years ago now, Mike, probably 4 or 5 years ago. And this is very, very nice stuff. It shows the craftsmanship of the Chinese. And some of the Chinese, of course, were extremely wealthy. Wali was very well off. The Hong family was extremely wealthy. And Quang Li was the equivalent to the Hudson's Bay Company. I mean, he would match them dollar for dollar.
He knew what he was doing.
Oh, yes, indeed.
And as you said, Quesnel just kept growing. No matter where the gold went, whether it went to Cassiar or Omanika, it still represented the source of supply.
Yeah, first the gold fields around Barkerville started to decline, the shallow gold, then the Omanika came into being, and then the Cassiar. Then they were lucky again because they discovered the deep ground on Lightning Creek. And so Lightning Creek came back into the vogue as they drove shafts down, 60, 70, 80, 100 feet into the Vulcan and the Victoria and the Vancouver shafts, and a new rush began in that area. So they really were lucky, and by the time all those rushes were through, Quesnel was well established, Mike. The Chinatown was intact. The Front Street was really quite a sight, and the stern-wheelers pulled up into Front Street, and we have a number of different photographs of Front Street right from the 1870s right into the 1920s. And a number of hotels. The Caribou Hotel was originally owned by the Hopwood family, and this was down in that area as well, and shows a hotel of the day. And so really it started to get on its feet, and the other towns slowly fell away. And I mentioned that there was virtually nothing left of Van Winkle. Van Winkle was gone. Keithley was virtually gone. With the exception of probably 50 or 60 Chinese, Quesnel Forks was virtually abandoned. Antler was mined out. Harvey Creek was gone. Richfield was essentially gone. Barkerville was still there in the 1880s and right into the 1890s. But by the late 1890s, there were only a handful, well, several dozens of people in Barkerville. Barkerville was not a big town by the late 1890s, although some locals say it was larger. But what saved saved Quesnel was this. In 1930s, a guy called Fred Wells came in and was working on Cow Mountain, and he established the Caribou Gold Quartz. And that was one of the great lode mines of British Columbia. And of course, then Island Mountain came into being, and another rush started, and of course they all poured through
Quesnel
again.
So from prosaic beginnings comes a flourishing town. Take a break here, because when we come back, there is gold in them thar hills, according to Bill, and we'll tell you maybe where to look. Don't go away. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. I've got a map in front of me here, and this map is treasure enough. It was a federal government map done in 1886 by whom?
Amos Bowman.
And it is so detailed. It has the names, it has the locations of cabins, it has everything on here. And this is Antler Creek. You were just alluded to it. This was a precious creek, eh?
Yeah, you bet. It was one of the great gold creeks. It was discovered, in 1800, in the fall of 1860, and really stampeded in 1861. A lot of coarse gold came out of Antler Creek, Mike, but the interesting thing about Antler Creek, old Antler town was destroyed because they went back and mined where the town stood, and they did all the shallow diggings. But in the later years, after those shallow diggings were done, miners began moving up into the branches of Antler Creek, and they began finding gold high up above the creek. 500, 600, 700, as much as 12, 13, 1,400 feet above the creek.
And this notes it, Chinese diggings way up on the mountainside.
Yeah, about 500 or 600 feet above the creek, on a creek. But what that indicates to me, if you look at other creeks such as Guyette Creek and so on, they discovered gold up there, Mike, that weighed 1.5 pounds. Some of the nuggets were 1.5 pounds. This means to an experienced placer miner that there was a high ancient channel, pre-glacial channel, that went high above that creek. And of course, when the creek deepened, it cut off parts of that channel, but part of that channel is still intact. And where you come across it, that's where you get the coarse gold.
Now, that's why the Chinese were digging way up there. But you don't figure they found it all?
No, of course not. Of course not. When this is what we call an interrupted channel, and that means parts of that channel are cut off. So you'll get some of that channel still intact in that high country, around Guyette Creek and around other creeks in that area, way off the main, way off Antler. And I think an experienced prospector, an experienced firm with a lot of knowledge of placer mining would be, well advised to take a hard look at the high ground in Antler Creek.
Well, is there any water up there for you to do any plastering at this stage of the game? This is dry country.
Yes, relatively, but you get a lot of spring freshets up there. And if the gold is good enough on the high ground, Mike, they'll get it down.
And there could be still some on the high runs above Antler Creek.
It's one of the creeks that has been concentrated on for high ancient channels. Antler Creek is probably the best in the Caribou.
Well, you know, I'll never feel the same about Quesnel again. It's just, even though it has a reasonably prosaic background, it stuck, as Bill has already described. It has 9 lives, and it survived rush after rush after decline after decline. And when you head back up to Quesnel, think of it in those terms when you go there now. That's all for Gold Trails. Back again next week with more. See you then.